This is Mr. Clark. I'm in the theology department, and today we're going to be talking about issues of race, especially as it concerns issues in service learning. What we're going to do today is we're going to kind of touch on maybe three major ideas that we think students at Loyola might encounter when it comes to race when they're doing service. And so we're just going to kind of talk about those three ideas, and we're going to try to be mindful of time as we're going through these. So the first one is just this idea of spatial racism, spatial as in spaces, physical and geographic spaces. So I guess the first question is, in what way can space be racial?
Yeah, so I can definitely speak toward that a little bit. I was kind of Googling some of the terms before our call just to make sure I really understood like what it means to, like what spatial racism really means. And kind of what I've gathered is the reality is, regardless of the space, there's no such thing as a racial or race neutral space, whether it's physical, whether it's political, whether it's psychological. It's always going to be highly racialized, which means that it's always going to be filled with opinions, thoughts, perspectives, biases for the individuals in that space of like race, whether it's their ideas of someone else's race or whether it's someone else's ideas of their race. So it's kind of important to remember that like really it's always, all spaces are racialized because of like the politics of people's thoughts or because of some of like the systematic structures in place.
Thanks, Frederick. So how does a space become racialized? How does a space take on that kind of racial identity that you're talking about?
Yeah, so I would say the minute, I guess, it moves from a thought or an idea, like once we start to kind of put those thoughts or put those actions on other people, or the like some of the systemic practices become more blatant and you can see how it affects one person versus the next, I would say that's how you move into more so the details of how it becomes racialized.
And it's not even like also just like normal, or it's like also goes back to just like, is a place safe, or is it safe because it's white, or is it safe because it's not safe because it's black? It's like that's not necessarily what's happening. Like just because something is a white space doesn't mean it's safe. And I feel like that's like a connotation that goes in a lot of different areas of like life, as far as it being a white area with white people in it. So it must be a certain way. But I really that's just something that has always like bothered me, but it's obviously something that's inherent in a lot of people. So.
You know, that made me think about a time, I think it was like my sophomore year. I was walking to a friend's house who lives in Wilmette, and I was so uncomfortable and so nervous. And this is at the same time I'm taking the CTA, like getting on the red line, taking a blue line, and walking home on the west side of Chicago. And I thought it was interesting that I felt so much safer like on the west side than I did like walking through Wilmette as a Black person. Like I was legitimately like terrified and just uncomfortable just being alone. I felt like people in cars were staring at me like what are you doing here? Are you lost?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
so how did we get to this place historically where there are spaces that are dominantly white and dominantly, I mean, we know that there's some history of segregation, but why is that still like that today, I guess? And how are we in this position where we have these space, as you say, that there are no racial neutral spaces?
well,
I think it goes back to, Imai, please.
no, go ahead. I talk a lot, so you go ahead.
All right, I'll take this one. So I think it goes back to like our fundamental rights, like just even coming out of slavery, like there weren't equal housing practices, and those equal housing practices just sort of trickled over time into segregation, into redlining, into white flight, that caused all of these communities to become just poor. And then once these communities are poor, there's no public education that's sustainable. There's no nutrition. There's nothing there for people to thrive off of except each other. There's no real way to like release yourself. There's nothing there. And then there's no grocery stores, which then leads to just poor health. And all of this sort of just trickles into another system after another system of just poor living. That's all it comes down to. And then it just becomes that way over time. And then you have to take these steps from a systemic and a higher level for them to trickle down to actually being equal for everybody. Like it's never going to be equal. These things are never going to be like there without like they're actually being changed from a higher level from government, honestly. Like that, I think that's the only way that there's actually change. People can't just like right their wrongs or create a grocery store in their area. Like that's just not a thing that's sustainable. Like we need actual help in these communities, and it comes from a fundamental level, not from like a walk past a person and their race. It's not that. It's really from the highest levels of our government where we have these communities that have nothing. It's very sad, but it's a real problem, and it has to be addressed from a local level and a federal level.
Alani, did you want to add anything?
No.
Okay. So I guess GQ, you've kind of already started to answer this question, but how is it that when we have the spatial racism, how does that kind of create and exacerbate or make worse the social inequalities in our society along racial lines? So how does that separate space make things just that much worse?
Well, it's one of those things where it's a construct then creates a cultural level of racism. Like all of these things just become cultural. It becomes like, oh, saying racist terms to people. It goes like it's weird because when you see it happening in life, like it's kind of terrifying. But it goes just like these like obvious segregations and obvious systemic like racial biases amongst communities just trickles into like people calling each other different names or saying like, oh, they're definitely poor. They definitely don't have these resources because they're from a certain area. And it just trickles into an area and not a people. And if you change the area in which people live, then the cultural norms will follow with that. But if there's nothing at the top, the culture will never shift. Like it really just comes along with the territory almost. Like it was designed to fail because there was nothing to help it thrive.
So, Oh, go ahead, Amani.
Sorry, I keep jumping in at the wrong time.
No.
No, I was just thinking, on Juneteenth, I interviewed my great-grandmother, and we were talking about how my family was the first family to like cross Cicero, the first Black family to go west of Cicero. And she was just telling me how beautiful the neighborhood was, but all the horrible things that her kids had to deal with. And she made the sacrifice like for her children, and she tells it like, like my husband and I did such a great job, but having my grandmother like next to her talking about it, it was just complete like terror, like reminiscing her childhood and how awful it was, like being a Black kid in a white space. And I was thinking about what Taquarius was saying as far as like the businesses in a community. They can reflect on how the neighborhood used to be and how they had pharmacies and like gas stations, grocery stores, clothing stores, all these things that normal communities have. And I'm like, well, what happened? And my grandma's like, well, all the white people moved and they took their businesses with them. And it was just so disappointing because you see vacant lots and abandoned buildings and businesses. And Black people in these communities, they don't have the capital to like start their own businesses. And so it's just a never ending like pool of poverty for generations. This is like in the 60s and now it's 2020. Still nothing.
So what you've pointed out that I think is valuable is just that along with space comes resources, right? So access to safety, businesses, healthcare, education, all of those things are in some ways attached to geographic space. And if you pull resources from that space, what disappears along with it are access to all these resources.
A friend asked me the other day, she's African-American, and she said, she's like, why would white people want to give up anything? Why, what's it at our advantage? Why should we give it up? And I think about, as Taquarius, as you were talking about change, I think white people are like, oh, it's going to take a while, or this is a journey. Well, and I was talking with her about this. She said to me, when a white person says that this is going to take a while, or this is a journey, that to me is that they don't want to give up their privilege. So I'm just curious, what do you guys think about, because you have a lot of white friends, right? Colleagues, you went to the Loyola, like what do you, and I'm not saying, obviously it's a collective, we all have to work towards it, but the reality is that white people hold most of the power and the money in this society. And so do you guys think that people would be able to give that up and really create change from a
honestly, I could definitely jump on that. And I think that's exactly what it is. I think you hit the nail right on the head. It just all really comes down to power. like recognizing the power that you have and recognizing like how you are at an advantage because of like what Aquarius is talking about, like a lot of the systemic things that are in place. And I think that's exactly what he was saying. Like, that's kind of why it's so difficult to like really see change, or so difficult to like really like point towards like growth from a grander perspective or on a larger scale, because it's like a lot of this stuff is fundamental. So I guess to answer your question, like, especially like with things that are going on like right now, like within the world, it's hard for me individually as a person to really like believe that like we're really making that much change, or like we're headed toward that much change, just because I recognize like the difference in power, the power struggle. I recognize like on a grander scale, like the reality is there's a lot of white people that recognize how they are at an advantage because of the systems that are in place. And it's a lot, if we're just being honest, it's a lot to, it's a lot for them to give that up, because now you're forcing them to recognize or like be aware of this. Then you're forcing them to go, okay, take a step back and be willing to relinquish some of that. So, I mean, I think in a perfect world, it's nice to say like, oh, like things are going to change, or like change is coming, or like kind of like you, I think it was either you or Imani was saying, white people, they say things like, oh, well, that's going to take a lot. I think it's a cop out, but that's just the reality of the situation. And that is them recognizing like, oh, damn, like I do have a lot of privilege. I benefit from it. And now you guys aren't asking me to be passive. You're asking me to like really, really change what's going on. Like, it's one thing to be like to consider yourself as somebody that's not racist, or like to consider yourself as somebody who don't like practice any like racist thing. But it's another thing to be anti-racist, like to be, those are two different things. Like, you have to like go out of your way to speak up and step out against some of that power that you hold, and that you recognize other people that look like you don't have.
So leave spatial racism behind for a moment and move on to an idea of implicit bias. So implicit bias rather than explicit bias, right? So what is implicit bias and who has it?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this. So thinking about implicit bias, I think that those biases are hidden or unconscious assumptions, preconceived notions, and prejudices that a person brings with them into any given situation. These biases are informed by our backgrounds. So our family background, our educational background, social, economic, and of course, our racial backgrounds. And they really influence how we perceive and think about situations that we find ourselves in. And go back to your question, Trevor, who has them? I would argue that everyone carries implicit biases, but the key is to be aware of them. And so, one thing we really ask our students to do is to interrogate their own biases. And I think that's like a very Jesuit idea when we talk about Jesuit reflection. We want to really ask hard questions of ourselves, questions like, why do we see things and people the way that we do? What assumptions for our service learning students, what assumptions am I carrying into a situation or an experience, and where are those assumptions coming from? And I think if you go through that process of interrogation, it's really beneficial to you, and it's going to make you a better person and a better student in a service learning setting. And the other thing I was thinking of with implicit biases, it does kind of connect to an idea that I think all of our students would be familiar with, which is white privilege. It's kind of an offshoot of this idea of implicit bias. So white privilege, if we think of it as this idea that white people do not face the same social barriers and negative assumptions and prejudices that people of color face. And what we would challenge our white students to do is to, again, be aware of that privilege that they carry into any situation, any circumstance.
Imani, how might a Loyola student experience implicit racial bias while doing service? And also, maybe at large at Loyola, how is implicit bias kind of coming out in all sorts of ways, just in the halls of the school as well?
Wow, you're taking me back. You know what? When I was at Loyola, I feel like I experienced so many like microaggressions. I don't even think I've kept track of them all. But what I thought was interesting is that white students and teachers, they genuinely did not realize that what they were saying and doing was like not okay. It was just so like, like why would you be offended by that? And I have also like, I don't know, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is I still get this a lot, even at 25, when I'm speaking to a white person, and sometimes even Black people, like, wow, you're so articulate. And it makes me so upset because it's so offensive for you to, like, in saying that, you're assuming that because you are a Black woman, this is not what I was expecting. I was expecting you to speak differently, to behave differently. And they say it like it's a compliment. Like I should be like, oh, thank you. Meanwhile, in my head, I'm just like, is she serious right now? And you kind of keep this going. I feel like I first experienced this when I was maybe like in 7th grade at an all-Black school. And I still experience this at work, like in corporate America. And so it's unfortunate that after all these years, it still hasn't gone away. I still get that compliment.
So the experience of implicit bias is not just something that happened at Loyola, but it's kind of carried on into your adult life.
Yes, unfortunately.
Thank you, Amani. I had another question. So when we talk about this unconscious implicit racial bias, how does that impact the kind of spatial racism that we were talking about earlier, and maybe other types of systemic racism?
Well, when I was telling that story, I always assume that they are saying that because they see that I'm Black, but once they hear that I'm from the west side of Chicago, they're like, what? No. Someone really requested to see like my driver's license. Like, I don't believe you're from the west side talking like that. And I just laughed and was like, dude, what? But he was serious. And I don't know, I think when you add that layer to it, it's like, oh, you must be from the north side. You must be one of the good Black people. It's just like, okay, I don't know why you would assume that, but it's just unfortunate that speaking a certain way allows people to make so many assumptions about like how you're raised, where you're from, like where you must have grown up, like all these things. And it's like, you've talked to me for 5 seconds.
I also think that goes back to my like other point about systemic like racism sort of becoming cultural ways of life. And I think the simplest example from my perspective is like when I was at Loyola and we're having the immigration debate about immigrants coming from south of the border. And from my perspective, like it seems like we were trying to make it like most kids in the class wanted to make it tougher on immigrants, tougher to make that transition to be an American citizen. But I feel like obviously in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, like immigration and coming from like I guess the European countries was a way of life. They have such pride in that. It was something that they hold true and dear to their hearts. But when these people are trying to do it now in 2020 or back then it was the 2010s, it was looked at like oh, these dirty people are coming and stealing our jobs and doing this and doing that. When none of that's true, these people are paying taxes. They're doing a lot more for our country than like your immigrant great grandparents did. Not to say they weren't doing a lot, but like they're doing a lot for our country even while not being being full citizens. So I always thought that was weird. Like that, like you have this like it's okay when we do it, but not when you do it. Like, and it just never sat well with me. So it's just weird how those like biases come into play. Like that's nothing else but bias. Like if you look at it from just like a black and white perspective of it just being like they're doing it and my ancestors did it. Like they should have the opportunities, the same like accessibility, but that's not the case because of these biases that have been so thoroughly interwoven in our culture and society.
So yeah, so what therefore is the difference between my grandparents and immigrants that are coming from south of the border today? And obviously, even the rhetoric when we talk about people entering the country undocumented, and people talk about securing the border, we have in mind a very particular border. They're not talking about Canada, right? So what
Yeah,
is
they're not.
right? So what does that say to us about the nature of this debate? There's a very particular group of people in mind when we talk about immigrants. Even the language of undocumented immigrant kind of creates a particular image in our mind, and I think that speaks to that implicit bias you're talking about.
It's also insane. Like if you know anything about also like American history, like we conquered the land, we took the land of Texas, Arizona, the whole Southwest like wasn't ours like 200 years ago. Like that's even more recently of an American crime that took place. So it's just weird seeing these people that literally it wasn't America. Like it literally was never America. We took it from Mexico. Like, and to have that same like this isn't your land, but in reality it's fully their land. Like it was always theirs. But it's just like that sort of like that ownership, that conquerorship, that mentality of it's ours. So now like you all need to behave a certain way or do a certain thing to be here. It's sad and just honestly the most clear example of like a bias.
Okay, if it's all right with everyone, I'm gonna move on to our third topic, which is, so we've covered spatial racism, we've covered implicit bias. I want to talk now about something that people refer to as the white savior complex. So I guess, what is the white savior complex? What does that mean?
So that's basically the idea that when there's an issue, especially like something like race driven, the idea of the white savior complex is that white people come in, they take over, of course, with the intent to help or to like save. But in the midst of doing that, they kind of take over, do things their way, take the credit for it. And it becomes less about like who you're helping and what you're doing to help them. And it becomes more about the fact that there is this white person that's come in to play the hero and, you know, save them from something that they might not have even need saving from originally.
I think thank you, Frederick, what Amani said about that we don't need to be fixed, you know, as Black people, we don't need to be fixed, or that you said that people think that you are less than. I think for students and, you know, being somebody who was raised in the Catholic Church, and you know, love is shown more in deeds than in words, right? St. Ignatius said that. Like I think, I'll say that the more I do for others, then the better things are. Whereas I think, as TQ said, we really need to look more to structural institutions and how to change them. But I would suggest, as you know, as students going into a service learning site, that you or I, even because I'll be going with you, hopefully some of them, but that we have this humility that, you know, we don't go in thinking that they need to be fixed, or even seeing them as a they, rather, and not necessarily trying to get things for ourselves out of it, but to be humble and to know that, you know, people didn't ask to be in some of these situations, and just to really try and imagine what it would be like if we were in their shoes, especially those, you know, who are in the shelters and having to go to the soup kitchen and things like that. So to practice humility.
Yeah, and to go off of that, Sarah, I think to get out of that charity mindset and into a place where you are thinking about social justice, that you are thinking about structures and systems that are creating these outcomes, that these things, and I think everyone has spoken really nicely to this point throughout our conversation, that these things are not the results of accidents. They're not random, that when we experience the world, we are experiencing the product of social engineering that has created this white power structure that has not been remedied in our history. And the kind of small attempts to remedy some of these structures and these inequities have been met with a very swift and sure backlash. So yeah, just going back to this idea that like that white savior complex. We don't want to condescend to the people that we interact with. We don't want to be in this kind of pitying, charitable mindset, but we want to be thinking about justice, and we want to view everyone that we interact with in their full humanity.
Great, well put. So I guess if I'm a student who has signed up for service and I'm hearing this, this might be kind of come as a surprise. I mean, how could wanting to help not just be an endlessly good thing? What might be problematic about this idea that I want to save, that I want to help? Why is that even remotely problematic?
Yeah, no, this is definitely something that Imani has touched on both in this conversation and then as well as we started a coalition in which we are from the West Side of Chicago. So we're trying to like figure out different ways that we can make impact on our community as well. And that's something that she's pushed both myself and Aquarius to think about all the time with everything we do. It's the intent versus impact thing. So, I mean, it's hard to say that one is more important than the other, but they both kind of work hand in hand. So, I mean, even though things are coming from a good place and, there's really like no bad idea of wanting to help someone, but you still kind of have to be very mindful of the community, what they need, who they are. Like we were going in to, just do cleanups on the West Side, and Imani was very big on like, just talking to these people, conversing with them, trying to understand their story, letting them know we're from the same community, because it's like, we're not looking to just go here and just pass out cans or hand out dollars. Like we need to understand, one, what is it they need? What are they going through on a daily basis? What do they see? And how can we like really give them what they need and let them know that that's what we're here for. We're here for them. We're looking to see how we can bridge that gap, how we can definitely still help and, make some change, but bring them what exactly they need and what's going to make a difference for them.
So I just wanted to say that, so I am working with TQ and Frederick on this like West Side Coalition, and a driving force behind that is like the need for conversation, not just with like local residents, but also with local leaders in the community. When I was at Loyola, I participated in this like service program, and we would go downtown and we would hand out like food and hot cocoa, and we would talk to homeless people. Or I don't even know if they were homeless, but they were just on the sidewalk, and we were on the sidewalk, so we were just talking and drinking cocoa in the cold. But it was a great time, and I remember like the moderator like of this group like telling us to always offer like cocoa and conversation, so that we are not to make people feel like, they're a charity case because they're sitting on the sidewalk in the cold. And in my mind, whenever I'm doing service work, I try to proceed with caution and lead with like care. Like it's a very delicate situation. You don't really know what you're walking into. These people are complete strangers. And sometimes people, they look better than what they've been through. Like you don't know like how far they've come. And I think it's important to, like, as you guys move forward and you're interacting with people, and these are adults and you guys are teenagers, there's also that aspect of it as well. I felt so uncomfortable talking to like 50-year-old men. Like I don't want to belittle him and make him feel like this little girl is coming to my rescue. So be respectful and just, I don't know, be gentle with people. So
I think that's really insightful, because I think sometimes our students, think of themselves as totally neutral, and that people don't see them as an embodiment of a lot of kind of social identifiers. Many of our students are coming from wealthier areas in the suburbs, and they attend an elite academy in the suburbs, and they go into the city and they're talking to somebody who's 2 or 3 times their age, and there is this anticipation that they'll just be kind of seen as an individual, but somebody whose life is not exactly where they thought it would be at their age, is looking at somebody who's full of promise and who has a lot of privileges and opportunity, and their whole life is ahead of them. That can be an alienating experience. So being mindful of that, I think, is really important.
I think too, just real quickly, I think it was Father John Deere, who's not a priest anymore, a Jesuit priest. I think he was too radical, but he said, don't just stand there, do something. Don't just do something, stand there. I would really hope that students don't just see this as a one and done, but this is a way of life now. And I know the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, which is a volunteer organization, their motto is ruined for life. Ruined as in like, well, now we really have to see the world. It's actually kind of a negative connotation. But my point is, this isn't just about going and helping people, but this is a way of life, and how do we work for more systemic change?
And all of that can be very uncomfortable. And I mean, I don't know how old the students are. How old are they actually? Are they like juniors?
So this particular conversation will be for juniors and seniors.
Okay. Okay. So they're like old enough to like start like really thinking about these things. And I think that's so key, because you're not going to be at Loyola in 12 months or whenever you graduate. You're going to be out in the world, and you will be far removed from like WOMED and that whole like social construct. And you will be on campus with people who don't look like you. And college is a very interesting time and an interesting place, and it challenges you and everything that you've learned your whole life. So I think that it's just so important that you really start to think about these things as you move into the next stage of life, mainly because you're going to get uncomfortable. And I think it's best to prepare yourself now. You will benefit from it later if you're able to be mature enough at this moment to start thinking about like, what am I doing, and like how am I contributing to like the system that I can identify as being messed up. Like sometimes you don't even realize the role that you play, or the role that you can play to make things better.
I think I definitely agree with them. The only other thing I'll add that I've learned over time, I feel like I'm talking about it a lot, and I hate being repetitive. But yeah, just embracing that discomfort, especially like in these types of conversations, in these types of settings, is something I'm literally still forcing myself to like be open to. I just turned 26 today. I'm forcing myself more than ever to have like tougher conversations about sexuality, tougher conversations about gender roles. So, I mean, it's definitely something that you continue to push on to, but it goes into other things. Like it's totally okay to be uncomfortable. It's totally okay to feel as though the conversation is getting tense. I think that's when you should challenge yourself to either contribute a little bit more, or maybe like try to listen a little harder. Just because that's definitely like when you can really feel some growth brewing.